There's an almighty battle brewing in this city, in this country, on this continent over artificial intelligence. Hi, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to a special edition of the France 24 debate from the Africa Forward Summit. There's already a scramble for Africa's mineral resources. How about its data? We'll be asking about digital sovereignty, how you scale up. It requires money, it requires energy, and what kind of guardrails to protect citizens in this transformation, this digital transformation. Is Africa ready for the AI revolution? And joining us, he is at the heart of it all, Snehar Shah, CEO of IX Africa. Your company has been up and running for 2 years, but you've been in the tech sector for several decades. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure. Look forward to the conversation.
Also with us is Wanjiku Gaku. She is you've looked at fintech, aid development tech. You're a consultant and a professional when it comes to investment. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here and looking forward to the conversation as well.
And Peter Addo, he's the Deputy Director of the French Development Agency, the AFD's Nairobi Bureau in your Kenya offices, which have a keen eye when it comes to what's happening with the digital transformation. We'll talk later perhaps about some of the bilateral announcements that have come out of this summit. Thanks for being with us.
Many thanks, and looking forward to this conversation.
Now, Snehar Shah had the good grace to let our own Bastien Renouille have a look around. It's called the Silicon Savannah, where his company is located. And it's, again, one of those companies that's at the cutting edge of it all, running one of Africa's biggest data centers.
This engineer takes us inside IX Africa, the largest data center in East Africa. Here, Kenyan companies store digital assets and develop artificial intelligence tools.
It's data that we are accessing from outside companies, cloud providers, for example, the likes of Google's, Amazon's. So when we build data centers, then we are able to access those services, all that data in our own country. So it's faster, it's secure from a data sovereignty perspective.
With all its startups and incubators, Kenya's so-called Silicon Savannah continues to grow with a valuation that has surpassed 10 billion euros. That's both huge and tiny. In the US, the tech market is worth more than 1,000 times as much.
Kenya has a population of around 50 million people. It serves as a hub for the East African community, which has access to more than 300 million of population. We've already secured our second site. We have plans to build twice the size of this data center, so around 53 megawatts, and we're already looking at our third site.
And over at Nairobi's Aga Khan Hospital, the future is now when it comes to AI.
Inside this glass slide, we have a small biopsy from a patient. So this is a patient who's suspected of cancer. And I'm just going to load this slide in here. And we're going to see how this looks like when it's scanned.
In just a few seconds, AI detects cancer. This project, developed by a US university, is supported by the hospital, which provides samples from Kenya. So far, African patients have been underrepresented in Western medical research.
What we're doing here is to be able to validate that database that is replicable for cancer patients in Kenya. Because, as you can see, our tumors might be different.
Doctors here marvel at years of research saved and all the lives AI is already helping to protect.
It used to be said that, in Africa, we could not make proper diagnosis. It's true because we have 100th of the number of pathologists as in the West. Well, we would need 100 more pathologists to be able to do that. And they have to go all in small towns. They don't have to stay in Nairobi. This can be taken anywhere based upon the Grundium, a little microscope that you saw.
When locals look at AI model from abroad, they call out inaccuracies and sometimes outright bias. But it's still early days for AI made 100% in Africa. Here in Kenya, the ball is now in the Parliament's court, where the battle is already raging ahead of next year's election over the best way to protect citizen data's privacy, but also homegrown innovation.
So Sneha Shah, we're going to ask about the, as you heard Bastien Renouille express it, the guardrails that need to be put in place, what kind of legislative help is needed, particularly ahead of next year. There's an election in this country, a presidential and legislative elections. But let's begin with what we just saw. The potential is there, this great leap forward. First, practical question, the energy. Where do you get the energy?
Yeah, so first of all, Kenya is a very progressive country. Many elections have come and gone. I'm privileged to be working here as a fourth generation family. And I think Kenya, we have the right ingredients in place. You talked about regulation. There's many others, including connectivity, talent, financing is coming in. But energy, we are blessed that 93% of our generation here is through renewable sources from wind, hydro, and geothermal. Not many people know this, but Kenya is the sixth largest producer of geothermal energy after Iceland and Scandinavia. And the natural resources are there. We just need to make sure that the governments are leading to ensure that the infrastructure and the regulation for power generation is in place for technologies like ours to follow.
I want to ask you about the money, but first, Peter Rado, on this question, we've seen some eyebrows raised in nearby Ethiopia, the Grand Renaissance Dam, which was billed as this fantastic opportunity that it was going to electrify the countryside, it would help development. Eyebrows raised because, well, they're renting out a lot of that power for data centers now. Is that a good thing?
Wow, that's an excellent question. Is that a good thing? It also depends on the priorities of these countries. It is important for them to be able to strategically outline the key areas of investment. I think the Ethiopians' move to have this particular dam, in a way, is a good thing. As my other panelists actually made mention of, that geothermal is one of the big areas that Kenya is actually moving
But does
for.
AI, and I'm asking about Ethiopia, but I
Yes.
could be asking about anywhere. I could be asking about Kenya.
Yes.
Does AI literally suck the energy out of the rest of the economy?
It does. Without energy, there is no scaling of AI. And this is very, very important. So all the data centers that we hear of, I mean, given the current hardware that we have and technology that we have, consume so much energy. And it's important that we leverage on renewable energy. And that is what AFD is doing. We actually one of the biggest financing partners of Kenya in renewable energy. And we're working with Kenyan and other operators in Kenya to be able to move forward on that.
Wanjiku Gaku, what do you know about grids? And again, how much do you allocate of a country's limited resources? We heard the Kenyan president at the joint press conference that he staged here on Sunday talk about the needs over the next 7 years are huge for this country. Again, how much do you devote of that to artificial intelligence itself?
Yeah. I think that's a really good question, and it's a question that's at the heart of the AI debate, because we do need energy to power our infrastructure. And if you look at the example that you're giving of Ethiopia versus the example of Kenya, Ethiopia does have a surplus of energy with relation to Kenya, so they can make those types of bargains when it comes to power allocation. But then when you look at at Kenya's power allocation, we're just on the margin of meeting our demands. So that puts us in a precarious situation, and it therefore means that we do need to have other sources of energy to meet this demand that AI infrastructure is going to demand. Are we ready for that? That's another question for the debate.
Perhaps I may add a couple of comments regarding Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is doing a lot of Bitcoin mining using that infrastructure, which is very heavy on the power. And Bitcoin mining is actually quite different from data centers. So I just want to maybe correct that.
That's an important point,
factually.
Yeah.
But when it comes to data centers and AI, I think what we're going to see and what we're seeing in Kenya is very pragmatic growth. So we are already.
So for you personally, what does that mean?
Yeah, so we are already powering AI workloads in Kenya. We're the first to bring some of the NVIDIA GPUs into our data center. And remember, we're not going to be running the large language models ourselves, because that work and heavy investments will already be done in other countries like US, in Asia. What we're going to be doing here is using AI for inference, and that requires less workloads from if you're running the large language model. So our data center today, we're building a 22 megawatt facility, of which the first 5 megawatts is live. That 5 megawatts we're going to be filling up in the next few months, starting to build the next phase. So that gigawatts of power, I think there's a lot of hype around that, but the reality is that we're going to be taking the right baby steps and to make sure that we don't build infrastructure and suck power out just for the sake of it.
Oh, we could talk about this energy issue the whole hour. Unfortunately, we're pressed for time, so I'm going to ask you about the money now. How do you raise money in a country like Kenya? You heard in that report they're talking about 10 billion. Seems it's a lot for Kenya. It's a drop in the bucket in a lot of Western countries, right?
Yeah, I think the beauty is that for good projects, the money follows. Kenya is still a very stable economy. The politics is quite stable. We are getting a lot of foreign investment in. But taking our example, we are funded by Helios Private Equity, which is one of the largest PE funds focused on Africa. So we raised $50 million from them a couple of years ago, and that was the seed capital. Now that we've shown our business is bankable, on the back of that, we've raised commercial debt actually from South Africa, which will take us to the next phase. So that's a living example of for the right projects, the funding is available.
So
Peter,
let me chip in. So the AFD worked on an AI investment potential index, and we noticed that Kenya comes out as one of the top countries in Africa. At least I think it's the 4th on the list, which really means that it's attracting a lot of investments in the area of AI.
And this in a country where there's a lot of public debt. I mean,
Exactly.
The coffers are empty.
That's what is really surprising. But what we also know is that Kenya seems to be a big hub in Africa, and especially in the East Africa, where we have a lot of talents also coming in to Nairobi to be able to innovate. And what I think is also very important, looking at some of the policies that the government have also made, for instance, being able to fly in without virtually visa-free, has been a very good incentive for tech startups.
Wanjiku Gaku, Kenya is a good bet for an investor?
Yes. And of course, I have a strong bias towards my country of origin. But that aside, if you just look at what Kenya is offering, what is our offering as a nation? And it's what Peter alluded to earlier. When you look at our talent and our talent capability, we have a youth population that is very vibrant, that is very adaptable, that is it can easily become scalable. And in the age of AI, where you need AI-augmented skills, that is very critical to that. Secondly, we have a digital infrastructure that's being laid out already.
On that first point,
yes,
because later we'll be talking about it when we discuss the issue of labor. Mm-hmm. High-skilled workforce that's coming onto the workforce right now.
Yes.
A lot of people here in this country go to university. The question is, how well do you pay them?
And that is an integral question that hits on the labor market and how the labor market has been structured. Because we're talking about around 30,000 graduates that are getting into the job market. That is not a negligible number. And these are trained individuals. But then, and this is where the question of AI and what AI can do for the labor market comes in. Because I always say that the problem of the labor market in Africa is not that we're going to have technological displacement, is that we need to create jobs and we need to create them at scale. We need a job market that can absorb the 30,000 graduates that are coming into the market. And with AI, that means that our 30,000 graduates need to be upskilled and their skills need to be AI augmented for them to play in the ecosystem that's coming up right now.
So you're coming to the heart of the matter, aren't you? And this, I know you were about to talk about infrastructure. I think the answer you'll give will kind of answer both. Kenyans I've been speaking to since I've been here, they've been talking about the great leap forward. And the analogy they all give is what happened when it came to mobile payment. Is it the same, though? Are we comparing apples and oranges, though. How great a leap forward is it?
Yeah. So at the risk of sounding skeptical, I'm going to say we're comparing oranges and apples. And the reason for that is when you look at the mobile telephony and the revolution that happened at that point, we had
where
a
suddenly
social...
you didn't need landlines.
Exactly.
You thought, how are we going to build copper, put enough copper into the ground, and then you didn't need them from one day to the next?
But then what we had was a very context-specific revolution. And I'm going to use the example of Kenya. When you look at the companies that got to scale at that time, they were indigenous companies from here. So that means that the solutions that they built were within the social infrastructure. They were made for the market. When they were made for the market, that means the scaling up was almost a given. And then the reason why I say we're comparing oranges to apples is because if you look at the AI infrastructure that's required and the CapEx requirements that come with that versus the CapEx requirements that were required by the mobile telephony era, they are totally different things. The unit economics for the mobile telephony era made sense. The unit economics of AI infrastructure at the moment are still being proven. And that just means that scaling up might not happen at the same level or at the same speed that the mobile telephony happened. So when we use that analogy, I get a bit uncomfortable because we're not necessarily we're almost disregarding or underplaying the costs that need to go into the scale-up that is required for AI.
So is it a great leap forward or not?
I don't think it's a leapfrog. I think it's going to be, to Sneha's point earlier, it's going to be a very pragmatic scale-up not a specific leapfrog. And the reason for that also is because if you just take the example of the LLM models, the AI value chain basically, where value is mostly captured within that value chain is not necessarily in our markets. And that is because you'll have like the infrastructure, you'll have the data, you'll have the cloud, you'll have the tech that's not necessarily here. The mobile telephony, though, on the other hand, we had a huge part of that value chain with the value being captured on ground. And for you to have that level of a leapfrog, you need a huge percentage of the value creation in a supply chain to be in that specific market.
So you're going to have to be patient. You agree, Sneha Shah, that it...
No, I think
Because when you hear some of the tech titans from Silicon Valley, they say the disruption is here. Half the jobs will be completely different within the next 5 years, within the next 2 years, says the boss of Anthropic.
Right.
But here, Wanjiku is suggesting that won't happen as fast as we think.
I believe we're at inflection point. We've done it once before with the revolution of mobile money, and in fact, I happen to be working at the cutting edge of that. We talked about talent earlier, and in terms of income generation for the graduates. So in fact, Wanjiku and I worked in a different organization in our previous lives called Moringa School, where we're training the tech talent, but in a very pragmatic way as well, because we're using the US principled bootcamp model, where in 6 months we're generating data scientists, software engineers, and also helping them get into jobs.
Isn't that a bit ominous to call it boot camp? Boot camp is not a pleasant place.
So basically it's a vocational course compared to needing a degree to follow a career in tech, and we're helping these graduates get jobs. Of course, as Wanjiku said, we don't have enough employers here, but the beauty is from our Moringa School graduates, 28% of our graduates today are working remotely for global companies and earning in hard currency. So there's something going there. We talked about regulation, like we had in mobile money, in our data center space also. We have very pragmatic regulation. We already have the data protection rules. We have the big submarine cables coming here from the big techs now. So we have all the ingredients here, and it's really our opportunity to lose if we don't consolidate all this. So I think with all the disruption that is happening in the AI world, we are also pivoting to make sure that we're keeping up with the AI skilling. Of course, we're having the local infrastructure here. So I think this decade we have a golden moment to replicate the success that we've had in mobile money.
Over a decade, Peter Ando, not over 1 year or 2 years, is what I just heard from Sneha Shah. So again, it's this question of how we'll talk about money and what is the most valuable thing. And with artificial intelligence, and of course that's the data. When we're talking about what creates the value, it's the work people have actually done. It's how people might take the transcript of this conversation and use it, for instance. So in that respect, are we on the edge of a bubble that's about to burst with too much money being poured into it? Is it going to be a lot longer than we think? Or is the scaling up going to perhaps happen faster than we think in Africa?
Excellent. The issue about data is extremely important and sensitive at the same time. We've been talking about languages, right? African languages. There are languages that are spoken that are not written. There are several languages, more than about 3,000 languages in the continent. And it's important that we leverage on some of these tools to be able to boost inclusion. But that raises a lot of questions as to how this data is being collected. And languages talks about culture, right? Languages brings about the people, it's about the culture, it's about everything. And sometimes, most often than not, language data is taken without people's consent. Or even when it's taken with consent, they do not even understand why their data is being taken. So the notion of consentment also comes in, especially when you're dealing with certain communities in the African continent where you have like elders, chiefs, community leaders, and all those stuff, because not everybody has the same literacy on how their data will be used. So the issue about data governance, on how we can be able to have a responsible use and reuse of data, is very important. And talking about data, one of the issues that we've also observed is that currently there's a lot of synthetic data online, right? So this is data that does not really reflect the reality, because some of these things have been generated.
So this
by
is what,
other,
like we did a show at last year
Yes.
about the future of music and all these scammers who put out songs that are made with artificial intelligence. Are you
Exactly.
saying that there's a lot of slop here in Africa?
There's a lot. There's a lot of data that's been really not, it doesn't represent the truth, right? Because these are AI-generated data that are being reused, right? So when we do not take into account the local context, or when we do not go down to the grounds to understand what is actually happening, then we will have a wrong representation of what is actually happening on the ground.
Is there any way for it to go slower so that this can be done, this thinking through, so that digital sovereignty means that the data belongs to the people in that village that you're alluding to?
In my opinion, it starts with education. Education at all levels, from the kids to the members of parliament. I think it's very important. For instance, if the members of parliament do not even understand what data is all about, what AI is all about, how will they make the right policies? How will they create incentives for investors to be able to be more responsible in the way they collect data and use data? With education, we can be able to train the youth who are now very creative, who want to create new initiatives or innovative solutions to address local problems. If they understand the implications or the ethical implications of some of these practices, then they will be able to build innovative solutions that are much more responsive, that adapt to the local context.
So Wanjiku Gaku, it's that whole question, and people who are not geeks, their eyes might glaze over because they don't quite get the notion, but it's essential to what was just said by Peter of an open or closed system. By that we mean, is it one where you're allowed to share how you've built whatever large language model you've made, or one where you keep the secret sauce to yourself? The big Silicon Valley tech companies at first adhered to the notion of open source. that's changed as they've seen, as they jealously guard their potential to make money. Here in Africa, how much of the data is kept elsewhere? How much of the important data goes to China, to the United States, to Europe?
Yeah, I think, Francois, when you look at it, data is the new gold, I'd say. And so I think it explains the shift that we're seeing now to more close-ended models out there. And maybe Sneha can chip into this. When you think about our data sovereignty and our source data here in the continent, I don't think much of it is hosted here. Much of it will be hosted in other cloud centers outside of the continent, which hits to the core of what Peter is alluding to. Then how do we safeguard our communities? How do we safeguard the people who are putting this data out and expecting that there will be regulation to protect it? We don't necessarily have that infrastructure or even governance frameworks in place to do that.
Because one of the frustrations expressed by data workers is they don't even know who the real client is. They're not employees, but they're independent contractors for a subcontractor, sometimes a subcontractor of a subcontractor of a tech giant.
Yeah, look, when it comes to data, we are the enabler to make sure that, especially the sensitive data, whether it's healthcare, financial data, that is stored and manipulated locally. So we're the first to bring a global hyperscaler into Kenya. So Oracle is the first to bring their cloud region here locally in our data center. So we got a stake in the ground, and we hope like the others, like AWS, the other cloud providers will follow, so that sensitive data does not need to leave the country. So we're enabling that.
What's your religion when you saw countries like Zimbabwe, Zambia, Peter Addo's native Ghana, who've pushed back against transferring the medical data over to the United States?
Sure. So I think
is that a good thing?
Absolutely, because that is sensitive data. When it goes outside, you don't know which cloud region will it be on. Will it be in the US? Will it be in Ireland? Also, with the geopolitics that's happening now, where data centers in the UAE are no longer safe. We're seeing clients coming to us and saying that they want to transfer the data back in the country.
So that's an encouraging thought. So Peter Addo, I'm going to ask you to play the French guy now, because you work because you work for the French Development Agency, AFD. What do the French have to offer at this point? We spoke with the Digital Affairs Ambassador. She was touting the virtues of open source, but also said it's up to companies to decide what they do. Right now, there is a French AI champion. It's tiny comparisons to the ones in Silicon Valley, Mistral. It's certainly been talked up a lot. But what role does a country like France have to play if you're sitting down with Kenyan leaders and the Kenyans who do business with both the United States and China?
Interesting. That's how I say it. It is important to diversify partners, and this is an approach that we are actually open to. Obviously, our country, France, has unicorns that are coming up, like Mistral, doing great in the AI space. We also have AI regulations, obviously in Europe, and for instance, France is the first EU country to be able to vote to ban social media for kids that are less than 15 years, okay? So we do have certain standards that we offer. Obviously, we have other countries like the US that are also offering cloud services. We have China that is also having cost-effective solutions, right, that are also, or fast deployment of certain initiatives. So I feel we live in a world of interdependence, right? So even the notion of sovereignty, we should see it as not just being alone, right? There is some system of dependence in between us. So I will encourage companies to selectively select, right, different players depending on where their strengths are found, right? So in France, we do have our strengths. in terms of regulations, in terms of technical know-how, in terms of, what Ministral is actually doing, and certain policies, which I think other countries like Kenya or other countries on the continent can also learn from to be able to move forward together.
So Wanjiko Gaku, you're a Kenyan entrepreneur. You work in education, in agriculture, in health, and you have the Americans come to you and say, look, we have this oven-ready system for you. You just have to hand over the data, and it will be profitable. How do you resist that allure? Because we've had a nice discussion now for 5 minutes on the digital sovereignty. Yeah. How do you resist that allure?
Yeah, I think to jump on what Peter was mentioning, that would be a very enticing allure for sure. But one thing that I would do is, and I think this also goes to the scale of nations, of African nations when we're getting into such negotiations, is don't consider it a full package. Don't look at it as it's either I take this package or nothing. Look at it as the perks within the package. What perk can the US, maybe they're a cloud center or a data center, what can they give me that the French from AFD can provide probably an energy solution that might make a lot more sense for me, for my business. There might be the Chinese who will be giving me more of the hardware at a cheaper price. So I think when you consider it as a whole package, that's when it becomes very convoluted and the issue of data sovereignty comes in very tightly. But then when you consider it with regards to what are the interdependencies within the framework that I'm trying to work with and that I'm trying to create, and unpack each of them and see who would be the best partner for each of them. Because to quote something President Ruto said this morning, he said, Kenya is no longer looking west, Kenya is not looking east, we're looking forward. And what that just means is that inherently at how we're thinking about progressing the nation, it's more on the partnership basis on what can I get from this angle, what am I going to give from that angle. So that would be the approach that I would propose.
Yeah, but that's the approach you would take. Nonetheless, you see how as the scale up happens, it comes back to the issue of money, and the Americans have the money.
That they do. But once again, I think we're living in quite interesting times where we're also seeing other nations coming up that also have the money. Like I think it's in Ethiopia where we're seeing a lot of UAE money coming in. Also in some of the enterprises here in Kenya, we're seeing a lot of Chinese financing coming in. So sources of funding are becoming more diversified than they were, say, a couple of years ago. And I refuse the narrative of there's only one source of capital, because I don't think that's necessarily the case. We might have many diversified sources of capital offering different things, offering different benefits.
Offering different things, different benefits. This issue of money is key. So is the issue of when you look at the sovereignty at stake here, Snehar Shah, this digital sovereignty, can you have digital sovereignty if you have to go abroad for your financing?
So I think, in Kenya, we're quite blessed because we like to think we're center of the universe, not only geographically, we're on the equator, we're in the middle of the time meridian, and, like Wanjiku and what Peter said, that, Kenya is friends to everybody. And just to give you, our example, we're bringing a US-based hyperscaler come into our data center, but our power infrastructure is actually deployed by a French company, by Schneider. So that's all Schneider. There was a bit of geopolitics at play as well because, the next best alternative for Oracle to come in was to go to another data center. But, they had infrastructure from a particular Chinese provider, and with the geopolitics, that didn't work. We are funded by, two Nigerian founders who live in the UK, Helios Private Equity, and they're funded by the IFC, a lot of the European, DFIs. So I think we need to segregate the sovereignty and the money. The money can come from different sources, but when it comes to sovereignty, it's about having the local infrastructure here, which can protect the data from the consumers. And we work with partners. So we bring in the US players, not only we are also bringing the second largest IT company in the world, which happens to be Indian. So they're part of the Tata group. So Tata, TCS, they're bringing their sovereign cloud into our infrastructure. So we are very, very neutral, whether it's a cloud provider or connectivity, and also the financing as well. So I think those two can be segregated.
Just quickly remind us, Wanjiku, this data centers issue, which we've been talking about a lot on this show, it's key. What is it, 19 data centers currently in Kenya? How does that compare to the rest of the continent? And you were telling me earlier there's data centers and data centers.
Yes. So I think we're the third on the continent with 19 data centers after Nigeria and South Africa. But then interestingly, and only 2 of those can handle the type of workloads that AI require. So we might seem like we're third when it comes to the numerical value, but when it comes to the actual capacity, we still have quite a load of work to do. So it's interesting what IX Africa is doing and trying to bridge that gap.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier about boot camps. Earlier, we had spoken with the president of the Data Labelers Association. Joan, can you... worked for a data center herself. She exceeded her goals, and one day to the next, she's let go. As an independent contractor, she banded together with others who have been trying to draw attention to this issue. And when we asked her about what guardrails, what kind of legislation, she was emphatic that it has to be taking a look at both outwards, abroad, and inwards.
Make sure that people, in case they do them harm, they are being held accountable and not being left scot-free to move from one country to another. Just make sure people are getting the bare minimum. If it's not there, like asking for too much, because at the moment that does not exist. So it's people who are working, but then their mental health has been ignored, despite the organizations are the ones who are causing all these harms to these workers. It's people who are working in this space, but then their backs, they're constantly having back pains and hand and wrist and swollen feet because you're powering artificial intelligence. But then you're not recognized anywhere. You're an invisible person, right? So let's just remove the precarity in this space. Let's just remove the invisibility in this space. Let's acknowledge the fact that there are people who have made this artificial intelligence intelligent.
Snehal Shah, it's this basic issue that goes way beyond artificial intelligence, which is paying people a decent wage and giving them a signed contract. How do we get to that point with AI?
So I think AI is an opportunity. Okay, yes, today you've had some data handlers who are sort of doing the human selection of images, etc. But AI can automate that, so we can move away from that low-skill labor, but actually produce the data scientists who can use the AI tools to build apps, not only for our country and our continent, but also with the cost effectiveness of our labor to provide that talent for global needs as well. And of course, locally using our mobile money systems, there can be more innovation to digitize our economy.
Should there be laws to regulate who you handle hire as an independent contractor and this sort of thing? It seems as though right now there's few guidelines.
No, absolutely. There should be laws, and that doesn't only apply to AI, but also if you look at the gig economy, the Uber drivers or the motorcycle couriers, they're all like contractors. So we need to make sure that the labor regulations are keeping up and making sure they're protecting those laborers.
Peter Addo, this is a problem in the developed world as well. In the developed world, there's the worry that AI is coming for our jobs. Here, if these higher skilled jobs have not yet been created, this leapfrog, is it a problem still? The fact that you're going from, you're not going to need to hire as many people when you have large language models. Is that a problem for Africa if the jobs had not yet been created?
Great. So what I observe on the continent is that the posture or the premise that AI is going to replace job is not really a position that is taken by a lot of experts on the ground. Most often than not, we feel that is the case. But in actual sense, there are a lot of challenges that the continent actually faces. There are a lot of issues in agriculture, in health, even in culture, right, that needs to be addressed. So AI is seen by most as a tool or a system that enables them to be able to leverage upon, to be able to address their local challenges.
Okay, so that's the glass half full. The glass half empty is, in a country like Kenya, you have half the population entering the workforce, and there's no job in the city.
Great, so that is excellent. So what we have been doing, so I'm just giving you an example on one of the initiatives that we are supporting, which is called Social Inclusive Business Camp. So this is part of the Africa Forward Summit that we're working on. We brought together 50 entrepreneurs in East Africa to come and discuss different challenges that they actually working on and how they leverage tools like AI and also how they are able to create jobs in their communities. So these are some of the initiatives that we are funding to ensure that entrepreneurs, given that the continent, you have a lot of youth in this particular continent, the idea is how are we able to help them to be able to move forward? And for instance, an initiative on what we call TVET, so Technical Vocational Educational Training, AFD is actually supporting initiatives like that. For instance, when we take Kenya, we have the population on the north of Kenya, right, Turkana, Marsabit, Isiolo, and all the other regions where you have the semi-arid areas. We have people there. We have great talents that are there that need digital training. And for instance, the statement of intent that was signed yesterday at the State House on the digital project that France is actually financing through AFD and also the French Treasury with the EU is to be able to support digital hubs and also to be able to build digital connectivity in these areas. And in addition to that, we also financing what we call the last mile connectivity in terms of energy, because the foundation has to be energy in connectivity, which is also very, very important. And in addition, education. So when we provide funding for youth in areas where they are not really that included, if I'll put it that way, it helps with the inclusion.
Wanjiku Gaku. At the end of the day, does artificial intelligence reduce the growing inequality that we're witnessing both in the developing and the developed world, or does it accelerate it?
That's a very good question. And I'm just going to use this statistic to respond to that question. The ILO had given a statistic where they said 0.4% of jobs in low-income countries are exposed to Gen AI. In high-income countries, that's 5.5%. That in itself already shows where the juxtaposition is when it comes to these different economies. Because when you look at our economies here, for example, 85% of Kenyan workers in the formal wage are not in areas that are exposed to Gen AI. They're not at risk of being erased. But then on the other hand, you have 80% of our economy that's informal. So what that means is we'll have a youth population. If AI accelerates at a faster rate than Kenya industrializes, we'll have a scenario where we have a huge mass of our population that's stuck in the informal sector and that cannot necessarily bridge into formal sector because of the AI augmented skills that will not necessarily be there, and it will be cheaper to do entry-level jobs, for example, with AI. So to the question of inequality, I think if not managed well, we'll have a scenario where that gap keeps widening. And it will be very hard to bridge it once it keeps widening.
Very last point on this.
I would just like to add, informal does not mean neglected or unequal. Kenya still has a growing and very high penetration of smartphones. We have different financing mechanisms to put the latest smartphones in the hands of these informal workers. And if we combine, mobile money, these innovative applications, there's an opportunity for us to really leverage the AI growth that we're seeing. So I absolutely see this as an opportunity to reduce the inequality.
And you're priming the pump for another conversation, which is the one on what you put on those mobile phones and some of the biases generated by the algorithm. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Snehar Shah, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank as well Wanjiku Gaku, Peter Adu. We could have done another hour. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for joining us here live from the Africa Forward Summit in Nairobi.